Hi guys. Yesterday we talked about how the country almost broke up in 1995. So why don't we do something a little bit different about how the country got a bit bigger in 1949? Let's talk about the entry of Newfoundland into Confederation. So Newfoundland, when the British started to colonize North America, there were a lot of different colonies. So we're all familiar with the first four provinces of Canada, being Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Quebec, and Ontario. So when they met in Charlottetown in 1865 to decide what the next steps would be for, a new colony of Canada, those are the four provinces that gave up being British colonies on their own to confederate to be one greater country. And afterwards, piecemeal, more places got added on. Prince Edward Island came on a couple of years later. British Columbia came a couple of years later. Manitoba came as a small state and grew and grew and grew. And all the lands that were owned by the Hudson Bay Company, called Rupert's Land, became the Northwest Territories. And that's what Canada was. But Newfoundland was always different. They had an opportunity in 1869 to join Confederation, but they decided against it. They had a big referendum. Man, I've been saying the word referendum a lot in the last 2 days. They had a referendum. They voted against it. There was, if you think there's a lot of misinformation and fake news, I hate that term, around right now, it was kind of like that a lot in the 1860s too. And it was, there's xenophobia around joining a country with with Quebec and all the French. So the people of Newfoundland decided against joining Confederation. They had another opportunity in 1892. Newfoundland was a bit more eager to join then. The Canadian diplomats were less interested in growing Confederation at that time. So in 1907, let's stretch it out there, make sure I get my date right. I was going to say 1911 for some reason. 1907, the British Crown gives Newfoundland Dominion status. So this is what Canada and Australia and New Zealand all had at the same time. In fact, Newfoundland and New Zealand got Dominion status the exact same day. What this meant was they weren't just a colony or like a province of Britain. They had a lot more control over what they did locally. So not quite a country, not quite independent. The British were still, in charge, but kind of like being 20 years old and living in a university dorm. Like, you're in charge of what's most of your life, but there's still things that mom and dad control. So that's all well and good. World War I comes. Newfoundland gets together the first Newfoundland regiment to send a lot of troops over to support the war effort, and nearly the entire regiment was wiped out on the first day of battle on the Somme in Beaumont Hamel. So that was devastating for the province, for the colony, for the Dominion. Jeez, so many terms. So you wipe out a pile of young people. That's kind of like that future of the Dominion. But afterwards, Newfoundland still has this Dominion status and can kind of do its own thing. Problem comes when the Great Depression strikes in 1929 and into the 1930s. So at this time, a big part of the Newfoundland economy, the fisheries, well, the prices just collapse on it. So there's a lot less of revenue coming in to the Dominion. Meanwhile, they're swimming in debt. Newfoundland built a big railroad, and they spent a lot of money building this railroad across the island, and it wasn't economically sustainable. So they have all of this debt, no money coming in. And in 1934, essentially, Newfoundland gives up its Dominion status. So it's like they moved back home with the British. So they weren't going to be, at this point, with the British taking over, they instituted something called the Commission of Government. So until 1934, the Newfoundland was ruled by elected officials by the people of Newfoundland. Once mom and dad took over again, when the British took over this commission of government, responsible government or voting was gone. So it was, again, keep making this thing. It's like, my house, my rules. So the British they put a governor in place, and they put a commission of essentially what the cabinet would be, but it was all appointed. So the people of Newfoundland didn't have any votes or say on any of this. So they went from being quasi-independent to being very dependent and not really having a say anymore. But World War II rolls around, and I did promise that today's subject would at least be tangentially related to World War II. It's a big subject, so we'll stick to this part for now. And at that time, there's a lot of spending going on in Newfoundland. So it's in a really important geographic location for getting things between North America and Europe. So not only does the Canadian military need Newfoundland and pour a lot of money into it. I mean, when you think of a town like Gander, Newfoundland, it didn't exist until World War II. It was more because the airport goes in to ferry things across, and then the town goes from there. Similarly, the Americans do something similar with Stephenville. Areas like Argentia, in the sort of on the Avalon Peninsula, so not too far away from St. John's, but still not that close a drive. Again, big American installation. So a lot of money is flowing in through Newfoundland, and there's not really any control over what's going on there anymore. So it came to a time where this wasn't going to be sustainable. After the war was complete, they wanted to find some option for what to do with Newfoundland. Because, I mean, World War II was very damaging to Britain. The country was more or less destroyed. You have a big effort to rebuild at home. Is it maybe time to cut loose some of these other places in the empire that they don't need to support anymore? So you see a massive decolonization around the world of former British colonies, gaining local representation. So in 1946, the British Prime Minister puts in place something called the Newfoundland National Convention. And people of Newfoundland voted to select the people that would be on this convention to figure out what's next. Because something's got to be figured out. And there were three main things that came out of it. Joey Smallwood, he pushed very hard for union with Canada. So there's a lot of shared interests. Geography is very close. It made a lot of sense. There was a lot of people wanting to regain the Dominion status, so that quasi-independent status to effectively would make Newfoundland an independent country again. And the third option was keeping it the same, the status quo, with having this top-down rule from the commission. So this national convention has the rights to negotiate with all parties to see what they can do and what's sort of going to be the best thing for Newfoundland. So they go to London, and they're not getting a lot of support from the British government. So what the Brits are saying to them is, we kind of want to go snip, and you guys can just do something else. Like, I don't care where you go, but you can't stay here. The British were they much preferred the idea of, hey, Canada's right there. And just swallow your pride, go join Canada. It's going to be a good gig for you guys. Do that. So there's now an effort to negotiate with Ottawa. And what is that going to look like? So the best way to put this one as well is, Canada's in the position of power in this negotiation. It's less a negotiation and more Canada saying, here's what we can do for you. You get to be a part of this bigger tax base. You get this big market right away. You're going to give up control of your fisheries because per the Canadian Constitution that you'd be signing on to, we control the fisheries federally. But suddenly your debt problems become our debt problems. And that's a pretty good offering that's coming there. So all these negotiations are complete and they're ready to go to the people in an election, well, a referendum. So when they do this referendum the first time, there's three options on the table, as I said before, with Confederation of Canada, Dominion status, keeping it the same. So the first vote going through is on June 3rd, 1948, and the winner is Dominion status, so quasi-independence, 44.6% of the vote. In second place, with a strong finish at 41.1%, is Confederation of Canada. In third place, 14.3% of people are like, you know what, this is fine, let's keep it the same. So you get a majority for responsible government, for Dominion status. But the way that this was framed was 44.6% is still not an absolute majority. That's not good enough. So 6 weeks' time, it's going to be a runoff vote. So that we drop commission status, we drop the status quo off the table. So it's gone. And now it's time for the people of Newfoundland to decide, is it going to be Dominion of Newfoundland or Province of Newfoundland? And they decide, with 52.3% of the vote, to go with Confederation with Canada. So it's a pretty good option for them, but it's still pretty narrow. So where's that difference in vote? Why was it still so tight? Well, when you look at what the people, where the votes were coming from, strongly St. John's voted for Dominion status, and the rest of the island voted strongly for Confederation status. So it was a pretty big split there. The people that were the Roman Catholic population as well voted heavily for Dominion status. But at the end of the day, Newfoundland joins Canada. There's a bit of a push towards the end to try to stall, but ultimately in 1949, Newfoundland joins Confederation. Has it been good for the province of Newfoundland? I mean, it's hard to say what would have, I think ultimately, if it didn't happen in 1949, it was going to happen eventually. Newfoundland is, and still is, very much a boom-bust economy. So what that means is, because it's so heavily weighted on the resource sector, so natural resources like seafood, natural resources like the mining sector, natural resources like oil and gas. Oil and gas is a newer part of that Newfoundland economy, but these are all very volatile, or there's a lot of changes that go on in these sectors. So, look at right now in the news, what's going on with the price of oil. If 1 year it's trading for $62 a barrel, and a year later it's $22 a barrel. Obviously, that is a big shock when you're only at a third of the revenues that you were going to get from that a year later. Similarly, seafood. It's all well and good when you can have these factory trawlers and you get all of the fish and you can sell all this fish, but your stocks start to decline. So when in 1992, it was decided that'd be a moratorium on the cod fishery in Newfoundland, again, that devastates that industry. If Newfoundland's in that all by themselves, I don't know how they bounce back from it. Other areas of boom and bust like mining, I mean, there's a huge amount of iron ore in the Labrador City area. But when the price of ore is high, a lot of people are working. When the price is low, not a lot of people are working. And you have such a large area that's very spread out population-wise. I mean, you have half the population of Newfoundland in the St. John's area, and the other half is over one of the largest islands in the world. Just infrastructure alone is going to be expensive. So if you have inconsistent economic revenue streams, but pretty high fixed costs that you have to deal with, it's really tough to do that on your own. And if you're not going to be getting a penny from London, because London's trying to snip off all of these different places so they can live their own lives and not be dependent on the crown, I don't know what's left for Newfoundland to do. I find it's an interesting thought of how, new provinces can join the country. I mean, nothing else really changed again until 1999 when Northwest Territories were split into Northwest Territories and the new territory of Nunavut. Will we ever see another new province join? Well, I don't see the populations of Yukon, Northwest Territories, or Nunavut being such that they can support full provincial status. I mean, one of the things with being a territory, you don't have the same powers over your area like a province does, but a province has a lot more downloaded to it. That means they have more expenses that they have to handle than a territory would, because a province can raise more tax money and they can do more of these things. The territories, they can't. So you're going to have everything's different in these territories. So would Yukon ever be a province? Probably not. Would any of the other provinces split up? I mean, at one point in the 1800s, Vancouver Island was its own colony, but then it joined with British Columbia. At one point, Cape Breton was its own colony, but it was joined with Nova Scotia. Would there be any benefit for people of Labrador to be their own province or their own territory? Probably not. I don't see a day where there's enough interest in any of these places to create new political divisions in terms of a province of Cape Breton or a territory of Labrador or a province of Vancouver Island. I don't see Alberta splitting into two at any point. There was not a particularly serious, but in the 1980s, there was talk of the islands of Turks and Caicos. So that's off of the Bahamas being a colony of the UK, colony of Britain. There was some very light chatter about them joining Canada as the 11th province. I mean, obviously it sounds pretty great to have a domestic flight to go to a southern destination like Turks and Caicos, but it was never really anything particularly serious. So I'm looking for some more ideas for what we can talk about in these future ones. I think I might take a trip over to Ukraine for Monday. It'd be a topic that I find rather interesting, but it has a lot of science behind it, so that's kind of tough. But I hope you found this kind of interesting. At least it's a bit shorter. I didn't take up too much of your time today. I mean, it's Friday, so I mean, because days totally matter right now. Um, so hopefully you got something from this. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or any subject ideas that you'd like to hear. So have a great weekend, and hopefully we'll see you again real soon. Okay, thanks. See ya.